25 Heavy Delta, runway 25 left, correction line number 2, following Tempe Heavy Airbus 3 mile final.
Okay, number 2.
What's going on, guys? Flyby Simulations here, and welcome back to another episode in my Aircrafts Dissected series, where we delve into every single switch, knob, and display in the flight deck of the Zibo mod Boeing 737-800. So in the previous video, we took a look at the pre-flight procedure for both the captain as well as the first officer. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the engine start procedure, and then eventually also pushback from the gate to get ready for taxi and takeoff. Lastly, I would also like to address a few other points that aren't exactly related to this episode, but are indeed related to this series, as well as the direction this channel will take in the near future. So if you simply want to get to the meat of the video, skip to this timestamp on screen here. If not, keep on watching. So firstly, I want to address my absence for the last week. If you are a regular viewer of the series, you might have noticed that I actually haven't posted for around 2 weeks now, and I didn't even inform you, which is inconsistent and unprofessional on my part, so I just wanted to apologize for that. Next up, for the rest of the series, the videos will all be coming out much more consistently so as to compensate for the lack of videos for the past 2 weeks, and also because I will be scripting the entire rest of the series together in order to record and edit everything in one fell swoop. Finally, I wanted to also address the arrival of Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 on the market, and specifically talk about the direction this channel will take to cater to that content. So I would like to clarify that no, I will not be moving exclusively to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 for all future content on my channel, and there are several other well-developed aircraft and tutorial-worthy topics available on X-Plane 11 that I would like to tackle first. That being said though, I will be covering some aspects of MSFS 2020 simply because it's new and I am as excited as anyone else who's been an avid simmer for a long time for this new generation of flight sim to hit the market. So in conclusion, you can expect to see content on Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 on this channel, but I just want to reiterate the non-exclusivity of that content on Flyby Simulations. So with that all aside, let's leave the formalities aside and jump into the flight deck and start with the before start procedure on the Zibo 737. Alright ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the flight deck of the Zibo mod Boeing 737-800. As you can see, all of the switches, lights, and panel states are set to the exact same position as they were in the previous episode, so we're pretty much ready to get started with the before start procedure. Now, before we do anything, let's start boarding the passengers onto the plane. So simply come down to this EFB and click on this Start Flight Leg option. You will probably hear a few passengers boarding the aircraft, as well as hear the flight attendants greeting them in the back. Moving to the actual before start procedure, the first item we have on the list is to make sure that the flight deck door is closed and locked. Now, you can do this manually by manipulating the door handle behind the pilots, or you can use an amazing immersive feature present within the Zibo mod that basically makes the flight attendants close the door for you and also wishes you to have a good flight. Now, this is triggered by the anti-collision light, which we will start later on in the procedure checklist, so we'll leave the flight deck door open and unlocked for now. Next up, we have a few more actions to perform within the CDU that we programmed in episode 9 of this series. Now, one thing to note is that in the detailed FMC programming video I did, I only explained the very important parts of programming the onboard computers to be ready for flight. This was done in order to not make the entire process even more overwhelming than it already is by introducing too many new concepts at once. However, now that you guys have a sound understanding of how to program the FMC, I would like to introduce you guys to another important page on the CDU known as the Legs page, wherein pilots will find every waypoint on their route and will also see specific speed constraints, altitude restrictions, headings, and distances between waypoints. In this case, we're going to be using the Legs page to be able to see our entire planned route on the ND. So in order to do this, simply go up to the EFIS panel and switch this ND mode selector knob to plan mode. Also set the range selector knob to 20 nautical miles to be able to see each waypoint. Next up, what I like to do to make it easier to follow along the flight plan is to go down to these display selector knobs and move this navigation display down from the inboard display unit to the lower display unit, right next to the CDU. Finally, we then come down to this CDU and click on this Legs page button, and voila! As you can see, we see a full list of constraints, headings, as well as distances between all of the waypoints on our route today. So the specific indication we want to focus on here is the step indication, which, when pressed, allows pilots to step through their route from waypoint to waypoint and follow that along this pink line on the ND here. As you can see, each time I press this button adjacent to the step indication, the ND moves a little so as to show a progression from waypoint to waypoint. We just want to make sure that we have no abnormal turns or weird routings in the middle of our route and step through the entire route. Now once we get to page 3 of the legs page, we come to the final stages of our arrival procedure into Los Angeles. Here I want to specifically focus on this vector indication here. Now note that this is not actually a waypoint, but is instead an indication to the pilots that after this Sierra Mike Oscar or SMO waypoint, the pilots should expect approach vectors or directions from ATC to guide the aircraft to the start of the ILS approach in order for the aircraft to capture the localizer and glide slope and land on runway 25 left at LA. More info on what a localizer and glide slope is in episode 5 of this series. As you can see, this pink vector line essentially travels indefinitely parallel to the runway. Hence, in our case, since we won't be traveling with ATC, we will be self-vectoring ourselves. This means that we will deactivate the LNAV and VNAV modes at this point and make a base leg turn at around this point in order to hit this Honda waypoint at 3,600 feet and then turn once again for our final approach to runway 25 left. Alright, so once we've taken a look at our entire routing and are satisfied with it, we'll go ahead and set the captain's CDU to the takeoff page by clicking on this route button and then going over to the takeoff page like so. On the first officer CDU, we'll set the legs page, so now we have the two most important indications for the takeoff sequence right in front of us. Next up, simply come up to this display selector knob and move the lower DU knob to the normal position, and also set the ND selector knob back to the map view. Additionally, at this point we will also verify that we see the N1 bugs on the upper display units, as well as the indicated airspeed bugs on the PFD, which we can just about see our V-speeds here, so we're good to go. Next up, we're going to be configuring the MCP or Mode Control Panel for flight. So as seen on the Ken Air checklist, we'll be setting the V2 speed into this IAS Mach display over here, so as to give the aircraft a maximum speed during the takeoff procedure. Then we'll come over to both the LNAV and VNAV switches here and arm them. Note that if the LNAV switch doesn't arm, that is perfectly normal, as some departure procedures have very tight turns right after takeoff, which require the pilots to put the aircraft on the right course to intercept the LNAV path before it can be captured, so you should be able to arm it above 400 feet AGL, or above ground level. In our case though, we have a straight out departure, so we have armed it successfully. At this point, we will also turn on the auto throttle system, which will allow us to engage takeoff and go around thrust during takeoff. Now, different airlines engage the auto throttle switch at different times, and this is completely dependent on SOPs, or standard operating procedures, but I like to engage it now so we don't have to worry about it later on during the taxi. Next up, we're going to come over to the heading display and set the runway heading in here, which is 284 degrees as we saw in episode 9 of this series. So put that in here, and finally we put the initial altitude in the altitude display. Now normally ATC will issue the initial altitude to the aircraft, but since we're flying without ATC today, we'll basically be climbing to the top altitude for our standard instrument departure procedure, the Westla 4 departure, which happens to be 3,000 feet. I'll show you where to find this in the taxi and takeoff briefing. So, speaking of the taxi and takeoff brief, let's conduct it now. Now in real life, the purpose of this briefing is to allow both the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring to be on the same page regarding the predicted taxi route, emergency procedures in case of medical problems on board, engine failures during or after takeoff, and so on. In our case, I'll take this opportunity to show you our taxi route from our gate to the runway, as well as our departure procedure from the airport. We don't really need to worry about any failures or problems, as this is a simulator and we're assuming we're flying a standard point-to-point flight between two large international airports. Alright, so welcome to Navigraph Charts, where we have access to aerodrome charts for the entire Earth. So what you're seeing in the background is a top-down airport layout for San Francisco. As you can see, this pink arrow represents our current position, So our mission is to get from our parked position here at gate Delta 12 to runway 28 right all the way over here. Now these letters you see over here all represent taxiways. Now thankfully, since this region of the terminal is rather cluttered, the chart itself has magnified this position over here. So we're going to push back and get onto this Alpha taxiway first. Then our plan is to travel straight on Alpha for a bit and then get onto this Foxtrot taxiway. As you can see, this taxiway will take us all the way to the end of runway 28 left here at the eastern part of the airport. Additionally, you will also see that we're going to be crossing 2 runways while we taxi on Foxtrot, so I'll be giving you guys some tips about taxi procedures and restrictions when we eventually get around to that. Finally, we will take this Charlie intersection / taxiway and cross runway 28 left at the very end and get onto 28 right for a full-length departure from San Francisco. I hope that was clear to you guys, but if it wasn't, then it should be made clear when we actually do the taxi procedure. If not, you can leave questions below in the comment section and I will be glad to help you guys out. Next up, we have our departure procedure, so let's get into it. Alright, so here we have the Westla 4 departure procedure. So I'm going to be going through this pretty quickly as I only want to cover the most important bits and nothing more. So as you can see, we'll be flying on a runway heading 284 degrees as we depart northwest towards the Pacific. Then we hit Westla at or above 2,000 feet at a maximum speed of 230 knots. We then take a left turn direct to the port waypoint and we continue climbing slowly to our cruising altitude. After port, we head southeast to Sussy while flying parallel to the San Francisco Bay Area and following the Pacific coastline, and we eventually get to Ibai, which is our departure transition if you remember from previous episodes. At Ibai, we expect to already be at our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, after which we will resume our normal route southwards towards Los Angeles. Finally, if we come down to this information placard at the bottom right, we see our top altitude listed here, which is 3,000 feet, hence why it was dialed into the altitude display on the MCP previously in the episode. Alright, with the departure procedure explained, let's get back into the flight deck and configure the aircraft for engine start. Alright, so the final few actions on the before start procedure all occur on the forward overhead panel. So let's head up there and start flicking some switches as per the procedure checklist. So we're going to come up here and first verify that the exterior doors are all closed. So make sure that none of these lights are illuminated. Next up, we're going to come to this fuel control panel and switch all of the wing tank fuel pumps on. Verify that the low pressure lights above the switches do indeed extinguish when these switches are moved to their on position. Now, since we're not carrying any fuel in the center tanks, we'll leave the center pumps off. We'll then come over to the right and turn on both the electrical hydraulic pumps as well. As you can see, that extinguishes the low pressure lights above the switches, as well as the 2 low pressure indications up on the flight control panel on the top left here. Finally, we'll turn on the anti-collision light over here, which will activate the red blinking light on the top and bottom of the aircraft fuselage, so as to signify to ground crew that we are about to start the engines. Additionally, this will also make the flight attendants come and close the flight deck door, and wish us to have a good flight.
Flight attendants, prepare your doors for departure, please. Cross-check and all call.
Alright, we've got everyone strapped in. Give us a ring if you need anything.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
So, ladies and gentlemen, for the pushback procedure, I highly recommend you guys to install the Better Pushback plugin for free from the X-Plane forums. It is regarded as one of the best plugins for X-Plane 11 and also has native support for the Zibo 737-800. Once downloaded, simply come up to this menu bar on top, hover over Plugins, then over Better Pushback, and select Start Pushback. As you can see, we have a top-down view of our aircraft. Now, this isn't a comprehensive tutorial for Better Pushback, but basically you can take the aircraft and position it to face outwards from the terminal building like so, and hit Enter. As you can see, the tow will slowly drive up to the aircraft and insert a bypass pin into the nose wheel of the aircraft to lift it up and push us back to the right position. The theory behind the bypass pin is that it allows the nose wheel's turn radius to increase from 78 degrees towards the left or right, up to 95 degrees to either side. This is especially useful during pushback in order to make tight turns around the apron or terminal. However, the pin must be removed after pushback is finished to restrict the nose wheel turn movement to only the forward 78-degree axis. Don't worry, all of this will be automatically done by the pushback driver. All you have to do is monitor it.
Welcome aboard, Captain. Toes connected, bypass pins inserted. Go and kill the parking brake when you're ready to go.
Alright, so as per the instructions of the pushback driver, the pushback tug is connected and we will go ahead and release the parking brake, which will start the pushback procedure. Now, one thing to note is that in real life, we would normally ask for pushback clearance, and the driver would tell us if we are allowed to start our engines after the pushback, during the pushback, or only start individual engines during the pushback procedure. In our case, we will be starting both engines after the pushback has been completed. No special reason for this, just want to explain the pushback procedure and the engine start procedure separately without overlapping or missing out on any concepts. Now, right before we release the parking brakes and start the pushback, I like to start the first officer's clock right now to be able to track the total time taken to get from our gate at San Francisco to our gate at Los Angeles. This is an optional step, however, so feel free to skip it if you so please. With that all said, let's go ahead and release the parking brakes now and allow the driver to push us back to our desired position.
Here comes the pushback. Line them up. Just about done here. Go ahead and set your parking brake.
So, as you heard, the pushback driver has instructed us to set the parking brakes so he can safely disconnect from the aircraft. We'll go ahead and do that just now. So once we disengage the parking brake, he will gently set the aircraft back down, and we then get an option to either disconnect the pushback tug and get a hand signal, or reconnect the tug if we wish to get pushed back in a different direction for whatever reason. In our case, let's go ahead and disconnect the tug by pressing on this button right here.
And we're disconnected. Signal and pin on the right. Take it easy and have a safe flight.
Alright, so once he disconnects, we want to make sure that the tug is well clear of the aircraft, and as he said, he will get a hand signal on the right, which is basically him visually showing us that he has disconnected the bypass pin. So what you're seeing here is the pushback driver showing us that he has indeed taken out the bypass pin from our nose wheel landing gear. So now that we've verified all that, we are clear to start our engines. Okay, so according to the engine start procedure, we make sure that we have the engine display selected on the lower display unit, which we do. Next up, we will turn off the packs, which will direct all of the bleed air produced by the APU into the engines to spin them up to their idle speed before injecting fuel into them. So let's go up to the overhead panel and turn these packs off. Once that's done, we'll come down to the right engine start selector switch and switch it to the ground mode. As you can see, the N2 readout on the lower DU begins to rise. We want to wait for it to get to 25% N2, which is the high pressure spool within the engines. While we wait, you can also hear the faint rumble of the engine starting up in the background. As it gets to 25%, we will go ahead and inject fuel into the engine by moving the engine start lever from the cutoff position to the idle position. As you can see, that also ramps up the N1 and N2 readouts. At this point, continue monitoring the N2 readout as well as the fuel flow and the EGT of the right engine. When the engine stabilizes, you'll hear a starter cutout and see that the engine start switch has gone back to the automatic position automatically. Once the engine has been started successfully, make sure that the N2 value is somewhere between 58.1 to 58.4%. Also, make sure that the fuel flow for the engine is close to around 620 to 640 pounds per hour, and the EGT doesn't get too high. Somewhere near 400 degrees is just fine. So, now that we've successfully started the right engine, we'll perform all of the same steps for the left engine as well. However, this time I'll be quiet and include text on screen to help you follow along as you hear, see, and experience the engine starting up. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we have successfully started both engines. In the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the taxi and takeoff procedure, where we will take this aircraft from here to runway 28 right and also take off from the runway. I'm going to keep this conclusion short as I want the transition from this episode to the next to be as seamless as possible, so if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to perform a full stop landing and the like button and the subscribe button, and press the bell icon for future notifications from this channel. Also, be sure to fly by the comment section and let me know if there's any questions you'd like me to answer for you. As usual, thanks for flying by.